One of their number, Lucius Pituenius, was hurled from the rock. Another, Publius Marcius, was executed, according to ancient custom, by the consuls outside the Esquiline gate, after the trumpets had been bidden to sound. On the next day of the Senate's meeting, much was said against the luxury of the country by Quintus Haterius, an ex-consul, and by Octavius Fronto, an ex-praetor. It was decided that vessels of solid gold should not be made for the serving of food, and that men should not disgrace themselves with silken clothing from the East. Fronto went further, and insisted on restrictions being put on plate, furniture, and household establishments. It was indeed still usual with the senators, when it was their turn to vote, to suggest anything they thought for the state's advantage. Gallus Asinius argued on the other side. With the growth of the empire, private wealth too, he said, had increased, and there was nothing new in this, but it accorded with the fashions of the earliest antiquity. Riches were one thing with the Fabricii, quite another with the Scipios. The state was the standard of everything. When it was poor, the homes of the citizens were humble. When it reached such magnificence, private grandeur increased. In household establishments and plate, and in whatever was provided for use, there was neither excess nor parsimony, except in relation to the fortune of the possessor. A distinction had been made in the assessments of senators and knights, not because they differed naturally, but that the superiority of the one class in places in the theatre, in rank, and in honour, might be also maintained in everything else which ensured mental repose and bodily recreation, unless indeed men in the highest position were to undergo more anxieties and more dangers, and to be at the same time deprived of all solace under those anxieties and dangers. Gallus gained a ready assent under these specious phrases by a confession of failings with which his audience sympathized, and Tiberius too had added that this was not a time for censorship, and that if there were any declension in manners, a promoter of reform would not be wanting. During this debate Lucius Piso, after exclaiming against the corruption of the courts, the bribery of judges, the cruel threats of accusations from hired orators, declared that he would depart and quit the capital, and that he meant to live in some obscure and distant rural retreat. At the same moment he rose to leave the Senate house. Tiberius was much excited, and though he pacified Piso with gentle words, he also strongly urged his relatives to stop his departure by their influence or their entreaties. Soon afterwards this same Piso gave an equal proof of a fearless sense of wrong by suing Ergulania, whom Augusta's friendship had raised above the law. Neither did Ergulania obey the summons, for in defiance of Piso she went in her litter to the emperor's house, nor did Piso give way, though Augusta complained that she was insulted and her majesty slighted. Tiberius, to win popularity by so humouring his mother as to say that he would go to the praetor's court and support Ergulania, went forth from the palace, having ordered soldiers to follow him at a distance. He was seen, as the people thronged about him, to wear a calm face, while he prolonged his time on the way with various conversations, till at last, when Piso's relatives tried in vain to restrain him, Augusta directed the money which was claimed to be handed to him. This ended the affair, and Piso in consequence was not dishonoured, and the emperor rose in reputation. Ergulania's influence, however, was so formidable to the state that in a certain cause which was tried by the Senate she would not condescend to appear as a witness. The praetor was sent to question her at her own house, although the Vestal Virgins, according to ancient custom, were heard in the courts before judges whenever they gave evidence. I should say nothing of the adjournment of public business in this year, if it were not worth while to notice the conflicting opinions of Cneius Piso and Asinius Gallus on the subject. Piso, although the emperor had said that he would be absent, held that all the more ought the business to be transacted, that the state might have honour of its senate and knights being able to perform their duties in the sovereign's absence. Gallus, as Piso had forestalled him in the display of freedom, maintained that nothing was sufficiently impressive or suitable to the majesty of the Roman people unless done before Caesar and under his very eyes, and that therefore the gathering from all Italy and the influx from the provinces ought to be reserved for his presence. Tiberius listened to this in silence, and the matter was debated on both sides in a sharp controversy. The business, however, was adjourned. A dispute then arose between Gallus and the emperor. Gallus proposed that the elections of magistrates should be held every 5 years, and that the commanders of the legions, who before receiving a praetorship discharged this military service, should at once become praetors elect, the emperor nominating 12 candidates every year. It was quite evident that this motion had a deeper meaning, and was an attempt to explore the secrets of imperial policy. Tiberius, however, argued as if his power would be thus increased. It would, he said, be trying to his moderation to have to elect so many, and to put off so many. He scarcely avoided giving offence from year to year, even though a candidate's rejection was solaced by the near prospect of office. What hatred would be incurred from those whose election was deferred for 5 years? How could he foresee through so long an interval what would be a man's temper, or domestic relations, or estate? Men became arrogant even with this annual appointment. What would happen if their thoughts were fixed on promotion for 5 years? It was in fact a multiplying of the magistrates 5-fold, and a subversion of the laws which had prescribed proper periods for the exercise of the candidate's activity and the seeking or securing office. With this seemingly conciliatory speech he retained the substance of power. He also increased the incomes of some of the senators. Hence it was the more surprising that he listened somewhat disdainfully to the request of Marcus Hortulus, a youth of noble rank in conspicuous poverty. He was the grandson of the orator Hortensius, and had been induced by Augustus, on the strength of a gift of 1,000,000 sesterces, to marry and rear children, that one of our most illustrious families might not become extinct. Accordingly, with his 4 sons standing at the doors of the Senate house, the Senate then sitting in the palace, when it was his turn to speak, he began to address them as follows, his eyes fixed now on the statue of Hortensius, which stood among those of the orators, now on that of Augustus. Senators, these whose numbers and boyish years you behold, I have reared, not by my own choice, but because the emperor advised me. At the same time my ancestors deserved to have descendants. For myself, not having been able in these altered times to receive or acquire wealth or popular favour, or that eloquence which has been the hereditary possession of our house, I was satisfied if my narrow means were neither a disgrace to myself nor burden to others. At the emperor's bidding I married. Behold the offspring and progeny of a succession of consuls and dictators. Not to excite odium do I recall such facts, but to win compassion. While you prosper, Caesar, they will attain such promotion as you shall bestow. Meanwhile save from penury the great-grandsons of Quintus Hortensius, the foster children of Augustus. The Senate's favourable bias was an incitement to Tiberius